Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Intersection, where faith and theology and practice meet. Delighted to be here today with Randy Harris, my co-host, and our special guest, Dr. Suzie Macaluso. Hello, Suzie. Thanks for joining us today.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Suzie comes to us through the Department of Sociology here at Abilene Christian University. She did her undergraduate work back in the day up in the Northwest at Cascade, finished a PhD at Purdue University in the sociology of religion. It's lovely to have someone who has made a career of looking at the sociology of faith, of religious practices. And we've got a lot to talk about today about the church health assessment that you were a part of, that you helped develop a number of years ago. So thanks for joining us today, Suzie. And thanks to those of you who are attending here today. We're glad that you're with us. Say hello in the chat room. Let us know where you're coming from, where you're tuning in from. We'd love to see that from you. And as we get deeper into the conversation today, you're going to have questions, and we're going to ask you to give those questions to Randy and I through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So you see question and answer, Q&A. Use that to post your questions, and we'll get to those later in the day today. Let's see, what else? I think that gets our some of our housekeeping done. I'd like to invite us to take a minute to just begin with a time of silence, of prayer, to recognize God's presence with us in this virtual community today. So if you'll bow, let's have a minute of silent prayer. From generation to generation, O God, you have been faithful, and we thank you for that faithfulness today and ask that you would use this time in conversation about the well-being of congregations to shape and form and instruct us as we seek to be faithful to your call in each of our lives. Through Christ our Lord, we pray. Amen. Well, because the church health assessment tool has been something that I've been a part of as well, I'm going to ask Randy to take point today and asking questions of Suzie, and I may jump in a little along the way with some response and dialogue. But Randy, why don't you get us started here and launch us?
Cool. Well, Suzie, once a year, my doctor wants to do my blood work and, tell me to eat better and all those things. And I have some idea about how I'm doing, but I don't really know until he runs the numbers. So tell me what church health assessment does. Does it tell a church if its blood pressure is too high? What do we find out?
Yeah, I think that's a great metaphor. The church health assessment is like that. It should be seen as a kind of thing a tool that you utilize as preventative care, right? So we can identify problem areas early on. It can be used by churches kind of in any place, whether they sense that they're really healthy or they know clearly that something is wrong. It can help at all of those different stages. The church health assessment has gone through a number of different versions, and a big part of that is because we want the instrument to do what is needed in churches. We want it to be useful to churches. And so we've taken feedback from consultants like Carson and others and really sought to refine the tool to make it as useful as it can be for churches, to help them kind of uncover some issues that they've maybe put on the back burner or that they're not even aware of.
just thinking, how many churches have we done this with, Suzie, since we began in 2017, maybe 2016?
I think we're right around 55 or so churches total. We have done 12 since we relaunched the new version of the survey last January. So we've done quite a few of these. So that feedback that we got from those first kind of 40 or so congregations really helped to inform the changes that we see in the new version.
So what would be some of the things that you're trying to measure? I guess it's kind of a question about what makes healthy churches or signs of illness. What are some of the things you're measuring?
Yeah, so when we set out to do this, Dr. Carly Dodd and I, a number of years ago, we really enlisted the help of church leaders and church consultants to identify what are the things that make a church healthy. And so from those conversations, those kind of intense focus groups, we came out with 9 factors that indicate church health. So we're looking at the vision and mission of the congregation, the programs and ministries in general, and how well those are supported, as well as the programs and ministries that are geared towards specific stages of life. And then the church's discipleship and spiritual formation efforts, the weekly worship experience and what's happening there, what we call congregational culture, which is kind of a measure of vitality. And then we also look at formal leadership and kind of the leadership team and how well they communicate to each other, as well as to the congregation at large. Then we also look at church relationships and the relationships that people have with other members of the congregation. And then we look at finances and facilities. So all 9 of those factors are all aspects of what makes a church healthy. There's not just one thing.
So maybe this isn't something you measure, maybe it is. I'm really curious about what a congregation's perception of their health matches up with what the assessment says, because sometimes you have loud voices in the congregation and you may not be getting the full picture that you would get by a survey. So what do you find in terms of a congregation's self-perception versus what the assessment tells you?
Yeah, so this is where the relationship between myself and the consultants is really helpful, because I can give that big picture of the survey, and then the consultant is working on the ground with the congregation and has a better sense of kind of what the leadership thinks, but also what the general membership kind of thinks before getting the results of the survey. So Carson, from a consultant perspective, how do you see those things matching up?
Yeah, I was just thinking about Randy's question in a little different way. Oftentimes the church has sets of perceptions driven by maybe dominant voices or narratives or stories that are present. By doing a church health assessment with a tool like this, where you're getting broad participation from the life of the congregation through an anonymous data gathering, it sort of begins to paint a different kind of picture, which often, in my experience, I see 2 things happening. One is a church leadership begins to go, we kind of always thought that this was the case. And so it gives affirmation and gives confidence to leaders to press forward or to act in a particular way. The second frame is, this is a surprise. We had no idea. Or it sometimes forces a church to deal with some dark or shadowy things that they've kept hidden. Just a quick story. The first time I did this back in 2017, one of the first churches we did scored really low on conflict. That is, they had conflict. And I remember sitting with an elder group, and the elders one of them said, "We don't have conflict around here. We get along just fine with everybody." And then another elder, after a moment of silence, I just kind of sat there, said, "Well, George," he said, "what about the small group that came to see us 2 weeks ago with that issue? And what about," and then he named 3 things that in the last 6 weeks have been sources of conflict. And he was like, well, now we can have a conversation, right? It opened that up by having used an instrument like this that brings the broad sense of the congregation onto the table for leaders.
So I'm wondering if how much free information we're really willing to give to the folks who've signed in today. Okay, realizing that all church is local, that every congregation is going to be different. Tell us a few things that you found. I think we're all really curious about. You've done this post-COVID now. We're all curious about the health of churches. So, can you give us 3 or 4 insights about what you're finding about the general health of churches that would be helpful to people listening in?
Yeah. So first thing to note is that there is bias in the sample of churches that we have done this with, because they have specifically asked to participate in the church health assessment. So from a methodological perspective, this is not a representative sample. However,
let's stop there just for a minute.
Okay.
So is the bias in the direction of more self-awareness, or is it in the bias in the direction of if a church is going through some sort of stress or sickness, they're more likely to ask? Does you think your group makes us look sicker than we are, or the churches are more likely to get healthy? We just wondered how that bias works.
I think that's a good question. So I think that at the beginning, we were seeing more unhealthy churches. But as we gained more consultants working with us, we started seeing it be used in congregations where, as part of just kind of a regular practice of, we're going to look for a new minister, or we're going to just start a new vision process. And so we have started to see more what I would deem healthy churches taking it. So I think the bias is really, in the early days, was towards more unhealthy churches, because those were the ones that were kind of in crisis and needed something like this. And now we're seeing it used on a broader scale. But I also think the bias is just, they are congregated in certain geographic areas. And so there are other issues that churches may have that we don't get to see, because they're not working with the Siburt Institute or with some of our other ministry partners who do this assessment. Gotcha. So that's kind of the disclaimer that the sociologist in me has to put out there.
Disclaimer is noted. Okay, now what do we?
So what are we learning is the important question. And I think there have been a couple of key things that have stood out to me. And one of those is that there are certain factors that tend to be lower and certain factors that tend to be higher. So for example, we tend to see lower responses, or people having lower opinions or perceptions of programs and ministries that are geared towards family life stages. So particularly the way that we think about the single people in our congregation, and the ministries and programs available to them. So that's pretty common. And to me as a sociologist, that kind of rings some bells, because that is kind of a key demographic that you need to hit in order to grow. So when we look at the data out there on churches in general and religion in general, and the rise of those who have no religious preference, and then we look at churches that are not meeting the needs of single people, those are going to go hand in hand, because that group is going to be largely kind of your post-college, pre-marriage group. And as people delay getting married more and more, I think the average age for first marriage for men is now over 30 years old. So you got to meet the needs of this group that used to be your young families or your young marrieds, but are now singles. So that's one that kind of strikes me. Another one has to do with being resistant to change. So we have a couple of different questions on the health assessment. One that is in kind of mission and vision of the congregation, and one in congregational culture, that have to do with change and innovation and being risk averse. And so a lot of our congregations are talking about kind of or are reporting that they are afraid to change, or unwilling to be innovative, or just aren't very innovative. And the needs of society are changing very quickly. And so if we want to be able to meet those needs, then we're going to have to find new ways to do it. The old models don't necessarily work for the current state of society.
Yeah. So when I think when people hear that part, I mean that makes sense. Human beings are risk averse, and churches are risk averse in spades, right? And you're not talking about doctrinal innovation, right? You're talking about innovation in terms of methods and that sort of thing. And if a church is resistant to adapting their methods and approaches, that would be a bad sign.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're talking about. So we're not necessarily talking about anything highly controversial or big changes in theology. We're really talking about kind of like how you approach visitors and guests, and how you kind of maybe structure children's worship or something like that. So they can be really little things, but they're an indicator of something larger. And it's just, it's not that we want to meet the culture or water down the message to attract people in a certain way. It's really that just the way we do life has changed, because more and more people are going to college for longer periods of time. And so things that were normal, 30, 40 years ago in terms of a life cycle just aren't the way our life cycle works anymore. And so I'm very aware of that at the college level,
Sure.
which makes me, I think, more sensitive to it.
Yeah. And I think we get the idea that, okay, there's some risk to change, but kind of what you're saying is, boy, there's a lot of risk to not changing. That group of 25 to 30s that we used to be your young marrieds are now your young singles, and so on. Carson, do you want in on this?
Yeah, I was just thinking that in the work that I do, often using the CHA instrument in congregations, that the real challenge for many churches is that 25 to 39-year-old group, often single or young family started. One of the things we notice in many cases is they're just simply absent in congregations. Or if they're absent, sometimes we have to go looking for them even to participate in the survey instrument. There's sort of a disconnect. And so this has big implications for futures of our congregations. If we're not passing on the faith to a new generation, then we've got our work is cut out for us there. I think we think about that in terms of youth groups and youth ministry, and we're thinking more fully about it in terms of children's ministry. But when people hit age 18, something happens. They walk out the door and go to tech school or to university, and we're not finding them coming back into our churches. This is Suzie, I could talk about this from a sociological point of view. It's very, very prevalent in our culture and context. And CHA points that out as being a concern for many of the churches that we see.
Yeah. And in terms of going back to kind of that risk aversion and lack of innovation, what we find, which is kind of like on the positive side, is in terms of relationships, those who are left in a congregation, so especially in congregations where they've seen a lot of people leave, maybe some changes happened that's caused people to leave, those who are left tend to really value one another, pray for one another, lift each other up, enjoy being with one another. And while that's a good thing, right, you have these strong relationships, that can also make a church a little bit cliquish. And make it hard for newcomers to come in and find their place. And so there's this balance that has to be found between, nurturing the relationships that already exist and encouraging those, and also being welcoming, and a place where newcomers can belong pretty easily.
Yeah, that's interesting. one of the things I've heard both of you talk about is that is on the assessment is whether people invite their friends to church or not. You know, there's kind of an old idea. Do you invite? What do you find about that in regard to church health?
Yeah. So on the worship measure, which tends to be pretty high for most churches, it tends to be an area where churches are doing well.
Oh, say that again. I think that's a problem.
So in the worship area, my eyes are gonna go to my other screen because I don't want to misrepresent this. But in our worship area, those types of questions that we ask about the people look forward to attending worship, that they feel like they encounter God in worship, that the preaching is helpful for their life. There's one question on there that brings the whole score down, and it is, I seldom invite others. And at first, when I was looking at this a few weeks ago, I thought maybe I'd made a mistake. I thought maybe that like they were trending so low. I thought, well, maybe I coded it wrong. Maybe because there are some questions that are negatively worded that we have to flip. So we have a mixture of questions that are positively worded and negatively worded. And so to get the scales to work, you've got to flip them around. And I thought, well, maybe I forgot to flip this one because it seems awfully low in almost all cases. But it's not. I didn't make a mistake, which was nice. But it made me start thinking about why. And I think that there's a shift in society in general about imposing our beliefs on others, or there's also the trend to kind of isolate ourselves. So when I think about even my own world, right, as a faculty member at ACU, as a church member, my circle is mostly other church-going people. Right? There are not very many people in my social circle that don't have a church home. So I never really invite others to church unless I'm talking to students or new faculty who are just moving here, because my circle has become very insular. So I think there's two problems. One, our circles have become much more insular. We're spending much more time with people who are like us. And I see that in the relationship side of things. In the CHA, but also there's a hesitancy to invite others, whether it's because there's some reason that you think they may not like coming, there's some aspect of the worship that you don't like, so you wouldn't want them to come, or it's because we just have this fear of sharing our faith. And that's a hard one we think, I know that Churches of Christ often don't like to be called evangelicals because of like the political terms that brings up, but like the very basis of Churches of Christ is in their evangelism, right? And in the going out and making disciples, and we're not doing as well at that. And I don't want us to necessarily go back, but be innovative and find new ways to kind of make those relationships. That was a lot more than you asked, but
yeah. Another thing that I've heard you all talk about that I'm curious about is the possible gap between elders' perception and congregation perception about the health of the church. So can one or both of you talk about that and just I assume that gap wouldn't be a good thing.
Carson, I'll let you.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I don't know, a year or two after we got going in this, we began, if I'm saying this right, Suzie, we began to separate out the scores from elders from the rest of the congregation. And then we do a composite bar graph of that shows how the elders' perceptions about these factors of health over and against the churches. And we find that sort of interesting. Our theory is that when we see elders and the congregation track together where their perceptions are very similar, right, within a percentage to or point or of each other, our theory is that churches tend to be healthier. When we see distortions, when the church when the elders are much more optimistic than the church, which sometimes happens. The elders are living in a different kind of space than the congregation, or the opposite, where the church is much more optimistic than the elders.
Do you see both of those kind of gaps?
Yeah, and Suzie, you could probably say more about this. I tend to think that we see probably church elders sometimes being a little more optimistic than elders or than congregations. But sometimes we see the reverse of that. That seems to indicate that the elders may not be listening well to their environment and are paying attention to what's really happening in the life of the congregation. And that often creates a wonderful place when I'm doing consultative work with churches for some really important kinds of conversations with elders and leaders.
Yeah. So one of the things, my theory is it's the same, but with a little tweak. So the congregations that are doing really well, they're pretty well in line. So members and elders are kind of on the same page, very little variation. The churches that are doing really terrible, that's where the members might be a little more optimistic. And I think this is because maybe the elders have some information that the membership doesn't necessarily have about the state of finances or the state of things. We haven't seen very many of these churches that are in like that dire of a position, but we've seen enough of them where I've seen some where they're very far off, but not in the direction you would expect. And then there's that middle portion, which are the kind of like unhealthy, but not on the brink congregations. And that's where we see the elders being a little more optimistic. I've run some statistics on this, but it's hard because you have so few elders per member. And so that gets tricky when we're doing statistics. But my hope is if I can look at all 12 of these recent congregations and aggregate that we can do some more fine-tuned stuff and kind of test this hypothesis, this theory that we have, and hopefully be able to put that on the Mosaic blog here soon.
So one of the things that can happen if you do something like the church health assessment is obviously that's going to precipitate some conversations that you might not have otherwise. And it might point out to you areas that need attention. So maybe this is the consultant part, Carson. Can we do anything about any of this stuff? You kind of, you diagnose that your cholesterol is a little out of whack. Do we have interventions that can actually help?
Yeah, that's a good question. Hope is the currency that we work with as people of God. So I have to answer with a yes. And I think I see that being played out in churches that choose to look at data like this that comes from doing this kind of instrument in their congregation and do what Charlie Siburt used to say, that reality is your friend. Let's get a good grip on what our perceptions are. And then when churches then began to say, let's take one or two of these areas and let's pay attention to it. Let's see if we can improve our cholesterol count by changing our diet, right? So could we find a way to welcome people into our congregation in some new ways? Could we find a way to influence or encourage or support single persons in our church? Or wherever those soft spots are, could we pay attention to that? Can we do some work in those areas? And that's what we see happen. When we see that happen, then we tend to see good things come out of that. We've had a couple of churches that have actually done this now too, and I think we've got one church who's done it a third time, as they've kind of over the last 7 or 8, 6 years maybe, have to see where they've made improvement. And I was talking to one of the elders of that church recently and said, well, we've made improvements in a couple of areas, but we've dropped off in this other area. And so now we're paying attention to this area. So it becomes a place for leaders to have some hard and important conversations and then ask, can we do some innovation? Can we attend to some things? And when leaders do that, typically they learn stuff and good things happen.
So I want to ask you two more hard questions, and then I want to continue to invite our listeners to put things in the Q&A, and I'll try to get through some of those. Can a church that is numerically dying be healthy? Can a church that is numerically growing be unhealthy?
So yes, definitely for a church that is numerically growing, they can be unhealthy. Growth is only one indicator of health. I don't actually think that it's necessarily the best indicator. A church that is declining can have some aspects of health, but ultimately, I don't think they can be truly healthy. Something is going on that is not healthy in that congregation. Now, if they're in a geographic area that is declining and it's not really anything, there's nothing they can really change, then it's a matter of kind of looking at the life cycle of the congregation, kind of some of that research, and thinking about what are their next steps? What do they want to do as a congregation to kind of move that legacy forward? And maybe it's helping to plant a church in a growing area. So there are some things, like sometimes demographics are just against a church. And so they can be kind of healthy, but not growing. I think that's pretty rare though. I think it might be slightly more common for a church to be growing and be showing some unhealthy characteristics.
Well said.
So, and the second harder question, I'm not sure, you've been doing this since when?
2015 might be when we started.
Hey, do you have any kind of quick notions about the church before and after COVID? Just any insights that you might have in the church pre and post COVID?
Church is smaller post-COVID.
Okay.
There are just people who were on the edge pre-COVID who have just stopped coming. Some of those may be lingering in our virtual services and kind of connecting in that way as they've let other things kind of take over that space that was reserved for church and for fellowship within the church. And so I am curious. I haven't tested this because we don't have any of the same. I guess we have one church that we've done we have some data from them pre-COVID and then some data in fall of 21. So kind of coming out of COVID. And so we don't have a lot of good data from the same churches to say anything, but I think we might see churches that are a little bit healthier because perhaps some of those who were marginal members are gone. And I don't know that that's a good thing. I think this might be an instance where the data makes it maybe look a little bit better than the reality, because some of those folks who were on the edge left. And so I don't have a clear answer yet, at least from the data. Maybe
Okay.
Anecdotally, we have some better evidence.
Okay.
Yeah, the data would be hard, like Susie's saying. My guess is, looking at some of the churches that I've been involved with in the last 18 months, is volunteerism continues to plummet. We're not seeing that. It seems like the degree of persons participating in their, hey, I'll help with the children's ministry, or those numbers seem to be continue to decline generally. And I'm increasingly concerned about the fact that we don't see a lot of participation from the 20 to 40-year-olds in churches. That gets combined with anecdotal data that I see and hear, and that concerns me.
So I'm going to go through some of these questions, and the people who wrote the questions may not recognize them the way I asked them. I'm going to try to do them very succinctly and have you answer them as succinctly as you can. Who initiates this kind of a survey generally? Is it elders? Is it ministers? Where does it come from? And just in terms of practical, if somebody says, okay, I think we need to do this, what would be the steps?
You want me to take that one?
Yes, please.
Yeah. normally we hear either from a consultant who's working with the church, or a minister, or sometimes an elder calls our office and says, I've heard about this, tell me more. And we end up with a little telephone conversation about the instrument. It generally starts with somebody in leadership who's asking these kinds of questions. Sometimes it comes up because the church is in transition, the preaching minister's leaving. Sometimes it comes because they're trying to sort of jumpstart a process of reflection about our mission and vision and values. Sometimes it becomes an overt act of starting a very clearly a vision process driven by leaders in a congregation.
So they would contact
Yeah. Just call church. Yeah, call Siburt Institute for Church Ministry and initiate a call. Usually I end up talking to a lot of people about this, or someone else who's a consultant.
Is Siburt the only ones doing this? They're not, are they?
No, we've got probably 6 or 7 consultants that use this. Some are inside the Institute, some are associated with Hope Network or interim ministry partners. Or we've got, I think, at least one person who sort of independently works as a consultant for churches, who've been through training with us and stay in conversation with us about their work and about what we're learning. So we have kind of this community of consultants inside and outside the Siburt Institute.
A couple of questions I think you can answer quickly that I think are really interesting. Y'all are checking out the church health of churches of Christ. Do you have anything to compare it with, say, in the Methodist, Baptist community churches? Can we make any comparisons across denominational lines?
There is nothing quite like this in other denominations. So I attend regularly. I'm a member of the Religious Research Association, the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion, and the Association for the Sociology of Religion. And so that's where the social scientists who study religion kind of hang out. And so in those realms, when I hear people talking about health and vitality, they're usually talking about 1 or 2 measures, like individual items on a larger survey. So take, for example, we're doing the Faith Communities Today survey. That'll be going out. We'll be sending out a link for churches to participate in that here in the next few days. That has a couple of items, but they're kind of that I perceive that my church is vital and healthy. And they're relying on measures of growth. So we don't have the same kind of strength of survey or instrument in other denominations. There's some similar things, some older stuff that came out that was kind of interdenominational, but I haven't seen that being used on a wide scale, at least in the kind of research area. I think there are lots of churches that are trying to do their own thing and find things that just aren't maybe tailored to their particular needs. I think the Presbyterian Church has done something, but it's not as robust.
It's a shame. It would be interesting to know.
Yeah.
One of our friends from up north is wondering about the bias of the samples, it mostly from Southern churches, and he's wondering if one's definition of healthy would change in a context where Christianity is on the margins of society rather than at the center. I think it's a very interesting question.
That is a good question. Our sample, so it represents, at one point I knew the number of states. It is predominantly where you would find churches of Christ.
Sure.
Right. So it is in those areas where we largely expect to find churches of Christ in Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Tennessee. But we have had churches from Canada and churches from California, and trying to think if we've had any in the UK. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So there are a variety of places, but that does play into the bias, because those are the groups that are going to be utilizing, or most likely to utilize, consultants from the Siburt Institute because of our geographic location.
So I am curious, do you think how you would understand health would differ?
I don't think so. So last spring, I was doing a study abroad with ACU in Leipzig, Germany. And so we were attending a church there. It was not a Church of Christ because the Church of Christ is German speaking only. I don't speak fluent German. So we were at an English speaking church, and the things that I would classify as health, I was also seeing there in a place where only about 8% of the population identifies as, well, not identifies as Christian, attends weekly worship, more identify because of state taxes. It's complicated. But a lot of similar things that I think of as making up church health, these 9 factors, I would say also apply there, because I think they are pretty universal.
And another way of thinking about that is, I think that mitigates some of that, is that underneath our instrument, when Suzie and Carly Dodd were working this out, we were looking at other instruments that are similar to this, that are not denomination specific, but are US or actually North American specific. There's one by the Hartford Seminary that's been around for a long, long time, that's kind of rooted in mainline denominational tradition. There's one that was associated with Willow Creek, and the name is escaping me now. Natural Church Development was a third one that's actually an internationally based church health assessment. That so those were a part of the matrix of resources that we were drawing from as we developed the church health assessment.
One of the interesting questions is, when we were talking about innovation earlier, I sort of hinted at the difference between methods and doctrine. And one of our questioners has pointed out, that distinction is not always quite so clear in churches of Christ as perhaps we made it sound, which is true. For example, women in leadership, is that a methodological or a doctrinal change? So what do you see in the data that would speak to that?
So there's not
that particular issue, or just that general idea?
Yeah, those types of issues aren't very clearly addressed in the church health assessment. The assessment is kind of for wherever your church is at. Where we see it pop up is so in addition to the 9 factors, there's also a variety of questions on demographics and participation in your church. But there's also a question about what you like most and what you like least. And this is the one place where there is an open-ended box where you can write what you want to write. And that is where I can tell if a church is doing this as part of a larger conversation about women's roles or about instrumental worship. Or this is also where I might see people sharing concerns about the way that LGBTQ persons are treated in their congregation. Is in that area. But the baseline of the church health assessment assumes none of those things. So we don't identify necessarily what the conflict is about, just that there is conflict, because each church has to kind of wrestle with that on their own and figure out how to navigate that conflict. And that's where the consultant comes in to kind of help them work through that. So the idea of resistance to change could be doctrinal, it could be theological, it could be, it doesn't necessarily have a name because we don't give it a name. So it's whatever the congregation deems as resistant to change. And that's where you need the conversation piece. So the church health assessment does a really good job of giving us the quantitative data, this kind of wide breadth of information, but it doesn't give us the depth. And that's where we need the consultant and the kind of focus groups and conversation with church members, church leaders, to really dive into what change are you resistant to? What is going on here? And that's why this instrument on its own is somewhat useful, but this instrument in cooperation with, or in partnership with a consultant and with that kind of deeper work, that's where the magic happens.
So the assumption here is you're not just going to write in and say, send me the questions and then give them to your church and you're going to get anything out of that.
Yeah.
No.
To get back to that, yes, for a church to utilize this, they have, it it has to be ordered through a consultant. A church can't just ask to have access to this. They have to also agree to utilize a consultant to walk alongside them, which is the same reason why you can't go to a lab and get blood work drawn and then interpret yourself, Randy.
Right.
Doggone it, you're gonna have to have an expert kind of walk alongside and guide you about what do these numbers mean. Yeah.
And so again, I assume that each individual congregation's information is confidential to that congregation.
Mm-hmm.
That does one questioner did raise the question about okay, is there anything that can be shared that would be helpful to everybody? I guess that's an article or I don't know, something in the online cyber. Is there information that can be shared with everybody without breaking confidentialities of local churches that would be helpful?
You know, one thing that occurs to me, and Suzie, say whatever you like here, but on our website, SiburtInstitute.org, and I'm sure Renee will get this all up, there is a page dedicated to the church health assessment. You will also find links to essays or articles that Suzie has published over the last several years about some of our learning. So having said that, I'll turn it over to Suzie.
Yeah, so that is one of the things that I am working on is how do we disseminate this information so that churches can learn from one another. And so those articles for the Siburt Institute blog are one of those ways. I do this in an academic way. I utilize the data for research purposes. But again, all identifying information is stripped out of this. I don't always know where the church is. So I'm the only one who has access to all of that data. And I don't always know where the church is because there are a lot of churches that are Main Street and Fifth Church of Christ or what have you, because we have a very, we have a geographic naming system. Like South Side is a pretty common one. And so that is helpful. So when we're talking about churches, we're always talking about them in these kind of general terms, unless we're speaking with the consultant for that congregation, or in a closed room where it's just maybe Carson and I talking. So yeah, we are trying to take this information and really be able to help churches on a larger scale, even beyond just taking the survey, basically being able to take what we've learned and apply it and think about it in their context.
Yeah, here's a question. I think it's important that you can answer relatively quickly. When the results are completed for this assessment, what do you do with them? Who gets them? Do the elders receive the results first and choose what to report to the congregation, or does the congregation have the full report and give an explanation on how to interpret these results? What happens to this?
Suzie creates a PowerPoint full color deck of about 40 pages of a report with lots of colorful slides and bar graphs that give expression to the results of that. That typically is reviewed with the consultant with the church leadership team, often utilizing a Saturday kind of morning retreat kind of format, anywhere from 2 to 4 or 5 hours. Working through and interpreting the data, letting stories and narratives flow out to kind of get some added clarity about that. And then typically the consultant will take a Sunday school hour and give a more brief version of that same report with those same slides to the congregation, so that the church leadership is practicing a transparency to say, church, here's what we've learned. And oftentimes the consultant helps coach elder or leadership team to say, here's some things that you might be able to say about how you're going to utilize this data or how it might be useful to us as we go forward in the congregation. So I think that gets it at this, your question.
It does seem it's almost, if you take this survey, it's kind of like a promissory note to the congregation. You better be ready to do something.
Yeah.
In response.
Which gets back to your early statement. Churches that do this typically are churches that are motivated to some level, either because things are going south quickly, or they're just motivated. We want to be faithful in our call to bear witness to the gospel to our community, and let's utilize this resource. And so, yes, it is a promissory note to the church.
And very quickly, as we come to the end, is there anything every church should be doing proactively that you've seen enough where you say, okay, instead of just being reactive, here's something that every church ought to think about?
Yeah, I think that churches need to be utilizing the strengths of the members that they have. So that means knowing your members. So the leadership needs to know their members, understand what their strengths are, utilize those strengths. And also thinking about your context and what is changing in your context that could help you become healthier. So I think in the question, someone mentioned changing demographics. So if you know that the demographics in your area are going to be changing over the next 10 years, like that's pretty easy to see. You need to be thinking ahead about what kind of ministries you need to have in place. Like, it may not be appropriate for all churches to have all of the same ministries because you have different memberships and different constituencies. And so I think that's probably one of the areas that I would kind of hit home.
Thing I would name is just that churches typically that do this typically score pretty well with regard to finance and facilities. They've got a degree of adequate physical resources. Where the key thing that I'm looking for is, what are they saying about mission, and are they actually carrying that mission out? And when it's one thing to have money in the bank, but it's another thing to actually be embodying that mission. And that's the thing that I'm often looking for as a consultant. What does that mission piece look like?
There are so many interesting questions that we're not going to get to. Again, if you can be very brief, do we have generational conflict?
Yeah.
A generational disconnect. Yeah.
The older members are often paying the bills. The future of the church lies with younger folks. Does that come out? I mean, it
usually comes out in the demographics because you've got people missing. So when you look at the demographics, this is also an indicator where if I look at the age distribution of the respondents, I can pretty easily tell you how this church is doing. Because churches that are healthy have at least some members in that 20 to, how do we break that down? But some members in those younger age distributions, their age distribution is going to look more like you would expect a normal distribution. Churches that are not so healthy, they're totally skewed. So I'm looking at one right now that Carson and I have been working with that is a fairly healthy congregation. Their distribution is normal. Churches that are really struggling, they don't have very many of those young folks. And so that to me indicates that there's a disconnect between those groups of people.
Carson, did you have a really brief?
I could
go forward. Okay.
Yeah, just keep on going, because yes, it's huge.
Let me give you both an opportunity to say whatever the takeaway or last thing you want to say to everybody is, and then I'm gonna pass back to Carson and tell you that if you're a church leader and have heard something that interests you, you can contact the Siburt Institute. They'll be willing to see if this is appropriate for your church. Okay, Suzie, you want to go first?
Yeah. So I think that my key takeaway here is that in order for a church to make change, to be innovative, they have to know what their state of things is. You need to kind of have a benchmark of how things are going to know what you need to do next. Because we are resistant to change as humans, because we tend to have selective perception, we can overlook things that are really problematic. And so having the church health assessment forces that conversation, or at least brings that conversation to the forefront. And so to me, that is the beauty of the church health assessment, is that ability to kind of be be to have to look at the reality of what exists rather than what you think exists.
Yeah, and one of the things that I see in churches as I consult with the CHA, and which is an extension of what we were saying a few moments ago, is that we are losing the 20 and 30 somethings.
Mm-hmm.
And to frame that in terms of discipleship, what I would say is that we churches generally need to be paying attention to how we are passing on the faith to a new generation. And without doing that, we're not really fully embodying our calling as the people of God. And I think the church health assessment often points that out in various ways to many of the congregations that I'm serving. So what I would want to say to our viewers today is just simply to ask, if I were to ask one question, is how are you passing on the faith to a new generation? And the generation that I'm keenly interested in is that 20 and 30 something.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Carson, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Yeah, Randy, thank you. And thank you all for being a part of this. The questions that are coming in, there's so much that we could do with those, but thank you for being a part of this. Contact Siburt Institute if you'd like to know more about Church Health Assessment, or find our consultants and just talk to one of the consultants that are authorized to utilize the Church Health Assessment, and find your way into more information about this good tool. Coming up, our next intersection is on April the 18th. We've got our guest that day is Dr. Wes Crawford, who's the Associate Dean in the Graduate School of Theology. We're going to be talking, he's a church historian and does a lot of work in Stone Campbell church history. We're going to be talking about church and race, and utilizing his work and research among Blacks and whites in the Stone Campbell movement as a place to start that very important conversation. So look forward to being with us on April the 18th with Dr. Crawford. Thanks to all who've been a part of this, to Renee and to Shelby and others who've been helping us put together this program. Suzie, thank you for being a partner today and for your good work with the Church Health Assessment. Grateful for that. And Randy, I'll let you close this out.
The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and give you peace. To him who's able to keep you from falling and to present you before his glorious presence without fault and with great joy. To the only God, our Savior, be glory and majesty, dominion and power through Jesus Christ our Lord, before all ages, now and forevermore, world without end. Amen.